So the topic of today is, what is the role of translation in the path to gaining Spanish-speaking fluency? How might that fit? Could that benefit? Could it be a distraction? The good, the bad, and the ugly associated with translation. We're going to get into that right now. My name is Scott Bryan, and I am one of these guys that a couple years ago set off on the path to gaining fluency in Spanish as a native English speaker. And so I've gone down this path, and I have achieved my said objective, and super excited about that. That's why I'm recording these videos. And I can tell you from my experience, translation was front and center as to how I achieved the success I did. And it starts with the idea that hablar comienza con pensamientos. Speaking begins with thoughts in nuestra lengua materna, and it begins in our native tongue. I'm sharing with you, by the way, a sample size of one. This is my own personal experience, but I believe it profoundly, which is I don't think in Spanish. I think in English. It's my native tongue. It's what I grew up speaking. It's where everything originates. I can't change that simply because I want to speak Spanish, okay? So everything starts there in English. And then ultimately, and over time it's gotten better, there's a translation that takes place. And then I communicate that idea in Spanish in voz alta, in my spoken voice. So Spanish is, and that translation is absolutely fundamental to speaking Spanish, in my opinion. And that's what I want to talk about today in depth. It's why I believe that is, and how you can use Spanish translations in order to gain fluency. So we're going to get all into that right now. So as we start into this, I want to just clarify a couple things. First of which is, what do I mean by translation? Why then I think that's a part of the process of speaking Spanish? And then I'm going to tee up limitation number one, or the big concern I think a lot of people have around translation. So first off, when I say translation, I'm talking about taking a phrase, a thought, an idea in English and translating it to Spanish, right? So whatever that is, it's a sentence. Typically, when we think about thoughts, we organize these in the form of sentences. So take a sentence as short or as long as you wish, and you say, okay, how could I say that same thing in Spanish? That is what I mean by a translation. And again, I'll come back to what I started this video with, which is to saying, I believe the act of translating has to take place in the process of speaking Spanish for a non-native speaker. Because my native tongue is English, I start in English by default. So the translation happens, it takes place. It doesn't have to be long and painful and with an awkward pause and thinking. Over time, as you get better and this becomes more ingrained and you start to rewire the brain, that space required for the translation happens super quickly, almost such that it's imperceptible and it feels as I'm just throwing out stuff in Spanish. But I think it still happens. Again, mis pensamientos. These are my thoughts, so I'm not going to go back to scientific literature on this. However, so think about this, and here's where I think the bad rap comes for translations, to be honest. A lot of people, when they think of translations, they think of literal translations, which does not work. Literal translations means you take that phrase in English with all these words, and you translate word by word to the equivalent in Spanish, and then you say it. Doesn't work. Does not work at all. Okay, initially, it will crudely get across your point, but it's not natural and it's not how you speak Spanish. It's a different language. All languages are different. They have their nuances, their structure. There's a lot of different things there. So hopefully that makes sense. And so when I think of translations, I think in the broad context of saying, take something in English, a thought, a phrase in the form of a sentence, and provide the equivalent meaning in Spanish, which, by the way, some of the words may be literal translations, but in general, they're typically not. The order of the words is changed up. There's nuance. There's additional words. It's translating a thought from English to a thought in Spanish, which is looks and smells and feels completely different. There's nothing literal about it. So that's where I think perhaps a lot of people have perhaps a negative connotation of translation when they hear it on the surface. And so the value of translation comes in different stages, and the way in which you translate evolves over time. So let me start you with the beginning. When you're just getting started on your path to fluency and you start a practice of speaking, my belief is that practice should be centered around translating sentences. Taking something in English, translating to Spanish, speaking it, focusing on pronunciation, the structure, the nuanced way you say the same thing in Spanish. And a lot of that, admittedly, up front is going to be somewhat literal. It's going to be very basic, but it gets the process starting. It's super powerful because you're taking this giant thing called language, which is overwhelming. If you think about it as a whole, like trying to communicate a story, for example, it's overwhelming. So the way you get around that is you translate a sentence and you translate another sentence and another sentence. And if you do that enough, you start to have the arsenal of sentences and ideas in your mind that you can start to communicate stories and put it all together. But translation is super powerful up front because it gets the process started. You get used to being able to communicate a single line. And only if you do that for quite a long period of time are you able to take now not just words but sentences and start to string them together and pull from this and pull from that, and then you can start expressing yourself in the form of a paragraph or a story or something a little longer. But I can tell you that my path to fluency was all around translations. And to this day, and I'm pretty darn advanced at this point, I translate sentences every single day. To carry this forward, I want to explain to you how translations evolve over time. And this is the really cool part. So imagine you start out and you're fumbling your way through, you're learning how to translate some basic sentences and you're getting it directionally correct, and over time you can get a little bit longer sentences. Maybe you throw in some slang, you're working on the structure, you're focusing on pronunciation, there's a lot of things. What happens inevitably over time is that you get to really nuanced ideas and you stop, and this is what's happened to me relatively recently, is that I stopped thinking about the words that I'm translating and the idea I'm trying to communicate. Because with an advanced level of knowledge, as you progress in your path to fluency, you get to the stage where you have enough knowledge of the language and enough things, and synonyms and different ways of communicating things that you don't have to deal with the specific word. And you stop thinking about this word and start thinking about what you're trying to express, and you might come up with a whole different word that really is not in any way closely related to the specific word of interest, if that makes any sense at all. Let me give you an example. My son plays basketball, so I've been studying some translations associated with the sport of basketball. I'm a very practical person. I like to focus and translate things that matter and are important to me. I want to be able to communicate what happened in a basketball game after it happens, and I do that stuff on a nightly basis. So an example is a sentence that they controlled the boards on both ends of the court. Okay, they controlled. This is the teams playing basketball, controlling the board. What is controlling the board? Boy, if you started thinking about that in the literal sense of how you would translate that, you're going to get into problems. Boards, you're going to say tablas, controlar las tablas. That doesn't have any relation to basketball. The correct answer is something like dominaran los rebotes en ambos lados de la cancha. Dominaran los rebotes en ambos lados de la cancha. Okay, dominaran, that means they dominated. Okay, that means it's another way of saying control, but it's a sports-related expression that you would use in something like this. Rebotes, los rebotes, rebounds. Because if you know basketball, you know that when you're controlling the boards, you're really grabbing and pulling down rebounds and putting it back up. That's really what you're trying to communicate here. Dominaron los rebotes. They dominated the rebounds in ambos lados, in both sides de la cancha, of the court. And yeah, a simple example, but I think it says a lot. And what's interesting, again, I'm pretty far along in my fluency, but I'm very aware of the fact that my thinking around what it means to translate is so very different than it was when I was getting my feet wet and getting started and working on translations. It evolves. And that's what's beautiful in a lot of ways about translations, is it evolves and allows you to evolve and expand and get nuanced in your communication of the language. And to wrap this all up, look, siendo completamente honesto, being completely honest, siendo completamente honesto, yo creo que la traducción no es opcional, es necesario para conseguir, para obtener fluidez. I genuinely believe translation is just, it's an absolute requirement on the path to fluency, just getting through, just translating over and over and over again. Let me just say this. Maybe there's other ways to reach the mountaintop and gain that level of fluency. I know I've tried a whole lot of things. My approach, what allowed me to get there, 100% was all based on translations. And it evolves. What I meant by translation day one is so different than the way I approach translations today. But it's the same thing, and it's critical, and it's a building block for speech. And I do not, for the life of me, see how one could be successful without doing it. So there's my thoughts about the importance of translations when it comes to the path to fluency. So hopefully this has been of use to someone and your thoughts on the topic. Thank you.